there is no coming to consciousness without pain. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own soul. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Carl Jung, the inner journey is an adventure. Like the heroes and heroines of ancient stories, we sometimes encounter unknown, difficult territories, or we feel helpless, without knowing in which direction to move forward. This experience is well known to those who have advanced on this path, from past mystics to independent seekers in search of meaning. It is the dark night of the soul. In this video, I aim to help you understand what crossing the dark night of the soul is, and to better understand it in order to seize the opportunity hidden there. Having experienced this crossing, I began very serious research to get through it and put my finger on key elements that will allow you to answer your main questions. However, there is no question of personal development or miraculous solutions in this video because its purpose is to show you the natural mechanisms at work in such a phenomenon. It is also to bring a message of hope and light, because crossing the dark night of the soul is difficult when crossed, but impermanent and extremely revealing of light. First, let's talk about what is the dark night of the soul? Why do we cross it? How to get out? What role does it play on the path to awakening? And how can we overcome it to move forward on our path? In what follows, I offer keys and answers to these questions based on my experience and that of past and present contemplatives. First, let's start with, what is the night of the soul? The dark night of the soul is a spiritual crisis that affects our daily experience and our inner life. Loss of motivation, energy, feeling of being lost, disconnection from oneself and the world. It is a real ordeal. Yet it is also an important step in a spiritual journey and carries with it the possibility of an authentic transformation towards a broader and more open life. How is it triggered? The night of the soul is always triggered by a spiritual evolution. This is an important criterion to differentiate it from other personal crises, such as depression, an existential crisis, or spiritual fatigue. Unlike the latter, it is caused by an inner evolution. These changes touch the heart of our being. They are a transformation of our deepest self. They lead us to distance ourselves from our former self, its interests, its relationships, its desires and projects. This old version of ourselves becomes like an empty shell in a world that has lost its appeal, a home where we find ourselves too cramped, yet we still inhabit it without being able or knowing how to free ourselves from it. This gap between old and new, and this period of transition towards a broader and fairer month, generates tensions and difficulties which make the dark night of the soul. The dark night of the soul and its symptoms are not so simple as many teachers present it. However, it is a complex phenomenon which will take very different forms from one person to another and which requires very personal solutions. Of course, general traits can stand out, such as a lack of interest in our daily lives and activities that used to give us pleasure. However, some of these changes may also be due to other crises and are not symptoms of a dark night of the soul. Now, let's have a look into this phenomenon and explore its real symptoms and solutions to help you see it more clearly and respond better. The dark night of the soul is a spiritual crisis which constitutes a difficult ordeal and which leaves us disarmed, but which carries the promise of true inner transformation. The night of the soul is often confused with other personal crises, most frequently with depression and existential crisis. It is important to differentiate between them in order to have the most accurate response to each situation. Depression. The dark night of the soul is often confused with depression. However, unlike depression, it is not caused by an imbalance in brain chemistry. Some of the symptoms of the dark night of the soul are therefore different from those of depression, an important criterion to differentiate them. If we worry about our inner journey, it is a dark night of the soul. In depression, these worries are rarely expressed. Existential crisis. The dark night of the soul can also be confused with an existential crisis. In these crises, our values change, and we begin to distance ourselves from certain of our activities or our relationships. These crises are beneficial, but unlike the dark night of the soul, they are not due to a profound spiritual change. They do not affect our life as a whole, but are limited to certain areas, activities, or certain relationships only. Spiritual burnout. the dark night of the soul is sometimes confused with another spiritual crisis that I call spiritual burnout. Spiritual burnout is fatigue, spiritual overflow. Sometimes in our enthusiasm for inner research, we immerse ourselves in tons of books, go on meditation retreats, and meet as many teachers as possible. These frantic searches, when they become compulsive, can lead to saturation and disenchantment. The dark night of the soul, on the contrary, is born from a profound spiritual evolution. It is often linked to a strong concentration on practice, as opposed to the frenetic dispersion of spiritual burnout. It is important to note, however, that the dark night of the soul can lead to spiritual burnout in a desperate search for solutions to escape from it. Responding well to the dark night of the soul requires understanding its real symptoms and not confusing it with other crises of a depressive or existential nature. Now let's talk about the real signs and symptoms of a dark night of the soul. The following symptoms are indicators of a dark night of the spiritual soul. Some are also common to other types of personal crises, such as those discussed above. But if a majority are present, you are probably in a spiritual crisis. You feel lack of energy. You feel more melancholy and sadness. You feel detached from your daily life. You feel like you no longer belong in your life. You notice that your thoughts become intrusive or very present. You feel lost. Without a goal, you cannot project yourself into the future. You don't want to go back to your old self. You experience new physical sensations. For example, a more intense feeling of emotions in the body. You better feel the atmosphere of the places where you are. You notice that many activities no longer give you the satisfaction they used to give you. The dark night of the soul is difficult, but there are solutions to overcome it and reap the full benefits. These difficulties are the guarantors of the authenticity of the path on which we are engaged. I suggest that we look at useful solutions to move forward. Here are 6 really useful techniques to overcome a dark night of the soul. I often criticize lists of general advice for resolving difficulties with our inner life. They often do more harm than good because they are not suitable for everyone, and good advice for one person and bad advice for another. The list below only focuses on suggestions that will benefit most of us. It is partly based on recent research that draws on the experiences of people who have gone through spiritual crises. Keep in mind, however, that other tools exist and might work better for you. 1. If you meditate, reduce the time spent in meditation. The concentration levels that meditation brings can amplify a crisis. It may be best to modify the meditation practice used to favor techniques focused on the body and breathing. Many adapted meditation techniques exist, and your practice can be adjusted to help you move forward. Note that some types of dark night of the soul are triggered by meditation. They often take very different forms from a typical crisis. 2. Spend more time in nature and calm environments. These environments immerse our minds in a state of natural relaxation. Recent research indicates that it generates beneficial responses in our brain waves associated with relaxation and rest. To benefit from it, you can spend time in nature or a park going for walks, walking, or your favorite sport or activity. 3. Maintain a balanced and energetic diet. Certain crises may lead us to control our food intake, but a dark night of the soul is generally not the time to begin a period of fasting, for example. Indeed, fasting modifies our brain chemistry and amplifies certain negative aspects of crises, such as visions, the presence of thoughts, or distortions of our perceptions. Changing our diet can also affect our mood, which can make an attack more complicated. 4. Cultivate well-being and positive emotions. On a daily basis, encouraging positive emotions can help us overcome the dark night of the soul. There are many ways available to you, such as loving-kindness meditations, self-compassion, inner work, for example with Reiki, acts of devotion, giving and serving, or positive affirmations. The goal should not be to pretend that everything is fine, but to try to maintain a feeling of calm in the face of these profound transformations in order to be able to let them express themselves and face them with the greatest kindness and the greatest courage. Spending more time in nature and calm, inspiring places helps us better experience the dark night of the soul. 5. Share your experience with someone you trust. This will be most beneficial if the person is familiar with the night of the soul and spiritual difficulties in general. but some have also found it helpful to simply surround themselves with people who are more calm and collected and open to this type of experience. 6. Explore the dark side that the dark night of the soul reveals rather than repressing it. In the dark night of the soul, unconscious aspects of our mind emerge into consciousness. Letting these things emerge and trying to accept them in order to be able to overcome them allows us to move forward. Remember, it is important to take your time while you are going through a deep soul transformation. This overcoming is achieved through work of acceptance and exploration of these dark aspects to release their rich potential. For example, certain aspects may reveal a trauma that we were unaware of, and which we can thus heal and integrate. The dark night of the soul then becomes the opportunity to free oneself from old patterns and blockages, and to experience a profound personal transformation. For many years, psychology had a very bad and justified reputation for how it approached spiritual crises, such as the dark night of the soul. For many professionals, it is similar to a mental disorder. However, recently, some practitioners and therapists have offered ancient tools to respond to the dark night of the soul. Approaches such as shamanism, for example, allow adapted support while respecting each person's path. These approaches respect the beliefs and choices of the person and allow us to reveal and integrate the meaning behind these crises. They are particularly used to support people experiencing psychedelics or people with traditional beliefs. Shamanic ancestral healing has made it possible to deal with trauma and difficulties in American Indian communities, while respecting and integrating their ancestral beliefs. In my practice, I have observed that shamanic ancestral healing can reveal a deeply personal spirituality in each person, particularly during periods of crisis. It reveals answers that people did not know they carried within them, and which shed new light and new meaning on their inner path and their life choices. These techniques thus offer a deep way to overcome and reveal the changes and the meaning hidden behind our experiences of the dark night of the soul. The dark night of the soul is an important step on our inner path. It allows for real, in-depth personal change, from which we emerge more alive, more mature, more open, more peaceful. Often inner life is cyclical, and more or less intense dark nights of the soul can reappear periodically. Learning to better understand them and acquiring tools to welcome them can help us integrate them into our journey. We can experience them as seasons of our interior lives, periods that invite us to return to ourselves and free ourselves from our old patterns to open ourselves towards greater wisdom, clarity, accuracy, and kindness towards ourselves and others. Thank you for watching, and I hope this video helped you to navigate your dark night of your soul.